Chapter 28 of Job, Pew Bibles, it's page 347. These 4 chapters are Job's monologue, if you will, and in a way they're a continuation of Job's response to his 3 friends, but not directly directed at them. This is more his final statement. If he was in a courtroom and he was the defense, this is, or even the prosecutor, he's giving his final statement to the jury before they begin their deliberations, basically. That is kind of what these verses are. They serve as a turning point in the dialogue between Job and his friends, and it transitions from Job's protest and his complaints to his philosophical reflections on wisdom and final defense of his integrity. So, chapter 28 is the first up, and first we will see the seemingly elusive wisdom. The seemingly elusive wisdom. And he opens with an analogy about the mining of precious metals in verses 1 through 11. Now, if you read those in the KJV, they can be a bit confusing because of the wording in there. Today we would use slightly different wording for some of the words. So like in verse 4, he says, "The flood breaketh out from the inhabitant, even the waters forgotten of the foot. They are dried up, they are gone away from it." He uses flood and waters and dried up, wet and dry kind of analogies. Basically the picture there is he digs a mine shaft down into the earth, is how we would say it today. And he removes the water from the mine shaft. He dries up the mine shaft so he can go down in the mine shaft and work. So there's some wording there that's maybe a bit misunderstanding, or we might misunderstand it depending on how we read it. It is, true. But anyway, in verses 1 through 4, Job describes in vivid terms how humans dig in the earth to find silver, to find gold, brass, iron, copper. It's quite remarkable, actually, the effort of primitive man in order to start digging in the dark recesses of the earth to find these precious metals, and the great lengths that man would go to the life-threatening risks that they would employ just to dig these metals out of the earth, that they might smelt them down and create ores out of them, that they might use them for weaponry, for valuables, for money, and etc. All these marvels of the miner's ingenuity, he discusses them, and they show a deep appreciation for the resourcefulness of humanity, its ability to unearth nature's natural treasures. But in verses 5 through 8, he talks about how on the surface of the earth, things are done relatively with ease. Comparatively, I mean, it takes work on the earth to grow crops, etc., and do all those things. But if we want the precious metals in the earth, we got to go to a much greater depth of work in order to get those things. But they're not necessary. The falcon, the vulture, the lion and her cubs, they wander about, they roam through the earth with no concern about how valuable the metals are that lay beneath their feet. Yet man, in verses 9 through 11, goes to great lengths to mine the earth. So great lengths that he cuts out rivers out of the rocks. He moves the rivers wherever to another place so that he can get at what's beneath them. That he dams the floods in order that he might shed light on the things that are hidden that he seeks to want. So that's his opening analogy. But despite all this human ingenuity in verse 12, Job emphasizes that there is one treasure that humans cannot find through this means. The imagery of mining symbolizes the human quest for understanding and knowledge, because human cannot dig for wisdom. People will go to great lengths to extract material wealth from the earth itself. But wisdom is of an entirely different category. It's not found by human effort alone. It's not a commodity that we can simply unearth. And so the quest for wisdom in verses 12 through 19, in the first part anyway. Verse 12, but where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? If you were to search out the earth, end to end, all around, you would never, ever, ever, ever find wisdom. If you were to dig in the earth, down as far as you can go, dig all the way around that you want to, you will never, ever find wisdom. If you were to search the sea, guess what you would not find in the sea? Wisdom. If you were to, like an eagle, soar to the heights of the heavens, guess what you would not find there either? Wisdom. You cannot find wisdom. So where is wisdom found? Well, before he answers that question, he goes to verses 15 through 19 where he says, he does know this, wisdom cannot be bought. If you can't find it anywhere and you come to the conclusion, well, I'll just go buy wisdom. How about that? Well, that's not an option either. Verse 15, it says, it cannot be gotten for gold, neither shall silver be weighed for the price thereof. It cannot be valued with the gold of Ophir, with the precious onyx or the sapphire. The gold and the crystal cannot equal it, and the exchange of it shall not be for jewels of fine gold. No mention shall be made of coral or of pearls, for the price of wisdom is above rubies. The topaz of Ethiopia shall not equal it, neither shall it be valued with pure gold. Elmer Schmick concludes that the point is that man's intelligence and determination enable him to accomplish amazing feats of technical ingenuity, but left to himself, he cannot find wisdom. Wisdom as a treasure is rarer than any other. So first he asked, where is wisdom found? And instead of repeating that question in verses 20 through 27, he changes the question. And in the quest for wisdom part 2, he says, where is it from? Not where is it found per se, but if we don't know where it's found, well, where does it come from? We know it exists. Wisdom is certainly in existence, so where is it from? Whence cometh then wisdom? And where is the place of understanding? I mean, verse 12 was a good question. Where do you find wisdom? Verse 20 is an even better question. Where does wisdom come from? Obviously, in verse 21, it's hid. Since it is hid from man, and since it is hid from the birds, from the depths to the height, obviously, wisdom is not from here. In verse 22, he talks of destruction and death. In that destruction and death, they only claim to hear rumors of wisdom. Now, that verse adds a bit of mystery to the whole thing, but those places, death and destruction, if you will, the forces of destruction, the realm of the dead, they were commonly held in those days to be places that held the deepest secrets of our existence. But he even notes, he says, even they aren't able to fully comprehend wisdom. And so his conclusion, only God knows the way to wisdom. He says in verses 23 through 27, God understandeth the way thereof, and he knoweth the place thereof. For he looked to the ends of the earth, and seeth under the whole heaven, to make the weight for the winds, and he weigheth the waters by measure. When he made a decree for the rain and a way for the lightning of the thunder, then did he see it and declare it. He prepared it, yea, and searched it out. God is omniscient, all-knowing. He knows everything. He is the source of everything. And therefore, if that is true, then God alone is the only one that can direct man to wisdom. God is omnipotent. He's all-powerful. He controls the weather. He controls all of that. He has power over every creation. Therefore, God alone determines whether man can search and find wisdom. And so then the question is this: what then does God direct man to do in order that he might find wisdom? Well, that's Job's conclusion. Wisdom is fearing God in verse 28. He says, "And unto man he said," God said, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to depart from evil is understanding." Now, Job is considered as, by most scholars, most commentators, we believe that Job is the first book of the Bible that was written down. Chronologically, yes. Obviously, that may differ if you believe Moses wrote it. I believe it was probably written down well before Moses. The style of writing is different and is more historical than Moses' Hebrew. So it's possible Moses compiled it. We don't know. But most everyone agrees Job is the first book of the Bible. Long before Moses wrote of the beginnings of the world, long before the 10 Commandments were written in stone and handed to Moses and placed inside the tabernacle there in the wilderness, long before the wisdom of Solomon graced the pages of Proverbs, this story was written down. And in Job is recorded the first commandment of God. And that first commandment of God is to fear the Lord, because that is wisdom. Now, that's interesting, because if you go to Matthew 22, I'll put them on the screen here, it says, "Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him," that is Jesus, "a question, testing him and saying, 'Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' Jesus said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment.'" And so Job's conclusion that wisdom is fearing the Lord is the theological resolution to the question, where is wisdom found and where is wisdom from? While wisdom cannot be found in or around the earth, and while wisdom cannot be bought for a sum, the reality is wisdom is still attainable. It's not a physical thing that we can hold on to, like I can hold on to this, but we can still get it. We can still attain wisdom. But the major truth with attaining wisdom is we can only attain wisdom by going about it the way the author of wisdom created wisdom to be. Only how God, the author of wisdom, dictates you to get wisdom, that's the only way to get wisdom. You won't accidentally stumble into it. And what he describes and what the author of wisdom, his first and great commandment, love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, well, that is the fear of the Lord. That is fearing the Lord. Loving Him, honoring Him, glorifying Him, respecting Him. They're all connected. Verse 28, actually, at the end there, it provides us a helpful analytical tool. How can we really know we have access to wisdom? How do we know if we truly understand the fear of the Lord? Well, I think the answer to that is by examining what do we do with evil. How do we respond to evil? The fact is, we should exhibit ourselves and look for in others external means in their claim to fear God. But humans are really, really good at deceiving one another. And we're really good at deceiving ourselves too. But the fact is, on the flip side, is that we should also examine ourselves and look at the negative external means of others and see what we do and what others do when they are faced with evil, and then we will truly know, am I wise? Are they wise? How do I respond when confronted with evil? Well, that's going to tell me whether or not I'm wise. How do someone else respond when they are confronted with evil? Well, that will tell me a bit about their wisdom. Now, obviously, we have all fallen short of the glory of God. We've all fallen short of perfectly fearing God. And since that is true, while we can grasp wisdom, we cannot possess wisdom fully, at least in this life. And so because that is true, that's why we look to Jesus, our Savior, because he, as a man and in all things, perfectly feared God. Through his death, burial, and resurrection, he made it possible for man to have given to him the perfect fear of God that he needed in order to commune and dwell with God on a face-to-face basis. That's what we call salvation, just in slightly different terms, if you will. So from chapter 28, Job shifts perspective a little bit. So gets all technical in chapter 28 about wisdom and valuable truth there. Well, then he kind of shifts and he says, and he goes in chapter 29 and discusses what I call the former glory. It's a personal lament for the past. And he begins it by reminiscing about, remember that time when God was with me? Remember that time when my life was full of blessings, when my children were with me, when I had prosperity. He speaks with a deep longing for the days in which he experienced the divine's favor, and I think rightfully so. I mean, we'd all prefer the good times to the bad times, I think. But that being said, we shouldn't discount the bad times, because within the bad times, there is great experience and understanding and wisdom to be found in the bad times. But these verses as a whole reflect Job's sense of abandonment, how he feels now, feeling like he's cut off from God's presence and protection. He says in verse 2, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God preserved me, when his candle shined upon my head, when his light I walked by through the darkness, as I was in the days of my youth, when the secret of God was upon my tabernacle, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were about me, when I washed my steps with butter, and the rock poured out me rivers of oil, when I went through the gates, through the city, when I prepared my seat in the street." And goes on there from that verse, and he talks about how he was well respected in the community and how he was honored by all, and he talks of his work in helping the orphans and the widows and seeking justice for those that came against him. In his conclusion in verse 18 is, "Then I said, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand." True. At the height of his prosperity, Job had every reason to believe that he was going to, or that his life was going to continue in prosperity and blessing. And he'd live out the remainder of his days in his nest. In other words, in his comfort, in his stability. And his expectation is, my days will be as the sand. I will live a long life. And that reflects the belief at that time that righteousness led to longevity and success. So we can see that some of those ideas were still present within Job's mind. Yet that expectation was shattered by his downfall. The memory of his former greatness now simply intensifies the current suffering he's facing. And so he ends the chapter and he recalls, "I once was respected. I once was admired. I was once revered. And now I am humiliated and despaired." And that leads into chapter 30, which is from the former glory, he now discusses the current misery. And he describes the drastic reversal from chapter 29 to chapter 30. My former position of honor is now a present state of degradation. Instead of being respected by the elders, instead of being respected by the young men, they mock me. These individuals, he portrays them as outcasts, sons of fools that laugh at his suffering. This reversal of his social status is painful for Job as well. He once had a position of honor and influence, but now he's disrespected. Correct. I believe so. Yep. I believe he's trusting the Lord, albeit confused. Yes. Yes. I think he's incredibly confused, and I think that ties in with what you asked at the beginning, and I think we're going to get some resolution to that, or some potential resolution to that. In verses 16 through 23, he discusses his body having been ravaged by disease and his soul as being tormented by grief. His pain is so intense he feels almost as though God has become his adversary. He says in verse 16, "And now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of affliction have taken hold upon me. My bones are pierced in me in the night season, and my sinews take no rest. By the great force of my disease is my garment changed. It bindeth me about as the collar of my coat. He hath cast me into the mire, and I am become like dust and ashes. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. Thou liftest me up to the wind. Thou causest me to ride upon it, and dissolveth my substance. For now I know that thou wilt bring me to death, to the house appointed for all living." The final verses of chapter 30, he reflects on this sense of isolation and abandonment. He feels like a man, I once showed compassion, but no one is showing compassion to me. And his conclusion in verse 30 and 31 is, "My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat. My harp also is turned to mourning, and my organ into the voice of them that weep." In other words, the thing that once announced and proclaimed my joy, my harp, if you will, the thing that I once proclaimed as my joy and my prosperity, now my voice simply announces and proclaims my sorrow and my loss. But that being said, we arrive at chapter 31, which is the certainty of innocence. And to start with, I want to give you a quote from Mike Mason. And he summarized chapter 31 in a very unique perspective. He said, chapter 31 is Job's Sermon on the Mount. For in it, he touches on many of the same issues of spiritual ethics that Jesus covers in Matthew 5 through 7, including the relationship between lust and adultery, loving one's neighbor as oneself, almsgiving and social justice, and the love of money and other idolatries. It's an interesting thought I had never considered. But here in chapter 31, the certainty of innocence. It's his final defense. He solemnly swears an oath of innocence. And he begins doing so by asserting his integrity in the matter of personal conduct, particularly in verse 1, in regard to sexual purity. He declares, "I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully on a young woman." This reflects his commitment to moral purity and self-control. The reason he gives for this in verse 2 is that wickedness would gain me nothing from God. And in verse 3 he says, "Doesn't wickedness bring punishment? Why would I want to be punished? If looking with lust is wickedness, and wickedness will gain me nothing from God, but in fact it will actually gain me punishment, why on earth would I do that thing?" And this, I believe, reminds us of Job's confusion. It would be logical that this destruction has come upon him if in fact he had committed some kind of wickedness. But since he didn't break this covenant he had made with God, then why the punishment? Job goes on, and he calls on God, judge me. Have I been deceitful? Have I been immoral? He invokes various curses on himself and says, basically, if I've walked or acted unjustly, if I've walked in falsehood, then I deserve to suffer. All in all, the section reflects his deep conviction. I lived a righteous life. I am innocent. My suffering is unjust. He moves from his personal conduct to the treatment of others, particularly the poor and the vulnerable. He asserts, I've always treated my servants with respect, always with fairness. He even says, I don't remember which verse there in chapter 31, but he says, my servants and I, did not God himself create us in the womb together? In other words, I'm not greater than they are. They're not lesser than I am. We're on the same equal footing. We've been created by the same exact God. So why should I treat them differently? And he emphasizes, I've been generous with the poor. I've been generous with the widow, the orphan. I've provided food, clothing, protection, justice. Compassion is central to his understanding of righteousness, and he believes, if I failed in these areas, I would deserve this punishment, but I haven't. Thus his suffering, he believes, is a profound injustice. Now, I will say, it is kind of weird when you read Job, his protestations about how innocent he is. And of course, we all know in our hearts who we truly are and what we've truly done. And so, Job is not being arrogant or prideful. There is a point where you can be arrogant and prideful, but there is a point where you can actually tell the truth about yourself. Yeah, Job wasn't claiming perfect sinlessness. He was just saying, I've not done anything to warrant such catastrophe in my life. Absolutely. So yeah, there is a point where we can, without being prideful and without being arrogant, we can truly say and truly talk about how perfect we are. Next, Job denies that I didn't place my trust in wealth even. I engaged in no idolatry. I never made gold my hope. I never rejoiced over all these material possessions I had. I did not, and he denies there. He says, I don't worship the sun and moon as many people do here in this nation. Instead, he says, I've been absolutely committed to God alone the whole time. So where does this come from? In the final section of his oath, he denies, I've not harbored any hidden sins. I've not rejoiced over the downfall of my enemies. I've not withheld this hospitality from strangers. And then he challenges anyone. He challenges anyone. Prove that I am guilty of any wrongdoing. And if so, bring the punishment if that evidence of that sin is found. And then verses 35 through 37. Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, that mine adversary had written a book. Surely I would take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown to me. I would declare unto him the number of my steps. As a prince would I go near unto him. In other words, if only I could have an audience with God, God either being his adversary or if he believed that his adversary was someone other than God. But if only my adversary had written a book about what and why this has all fallen upon me, then I would wear it as a crown. I could gladly say to everyone, hey, I see all this wickedness came upon me. I screwed up. I sinned big time, and therefore all this has happened. Instead, he's sitting there saying, I did not sin, and all of this has happened. I'm confused. I don't understand. I don't know why. In his conclusion, in verses 39 and 40, is that if I have been dishonest, if I have been unjust, then let thistles grow instead of wheat. Let weeds grow instead of barley. And that final image reflects Job's desire for justice. If he is guilty, then he should be cursed. But if he is innocent, then his suffering is most certainly unjust. In verse 40 ends, let thistles grow instead of wheat, and cockle, which is weeds, instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. Now, not that Job would say nothing more, but again, it's kind of like in the courtroom. He's resting his case. My case is resting. This is all it was. I am finished. G. Campbell Morgan said this: at this point, then, we have reached the end of Job's expressions of pain, and the end is silence. That is God's opportunity for speech. God often waits until we have said everything, and then in silence, prepared for such speech, He answers. Chapter 32, verse 1 says, so these three men, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Now, again, they still didn't believe him. They still did not trust him. They believed he was righteous simply in his own eyes, but he was righteous nonetheless. One more quote, David Guzik. One more man will try in vain to fix the problem, and then God will appear. We might rightly say that God, silent to this point, could not or would not appear and speak until all the arguments of man were exhausted. Maybe the lesson we might learn is this: when we are faced with such trouble like Job, the first thing we should do is examine ourselves. Ensure there is no sin within us. We can take advice from others, spiritual leaders, families, others, friends, foes even, I suppose. We can take advice from others, but we should always run the truth. We should always run the advice that they give through the filter of the truth of Scripture. And then the next step I think we should do is we should pour out our heart to God. Literally lay it all out on the table. And then be silent. And allow God to speak in the silence of our souls. And that's basically where Job's at. The defense rests. Not knowing that Elihu was about to speak up, in which that's what we'll look at next week, is Elihu speaks, and Elihu has 4 messages to Job over 6 chapters, I believe it is. But chapter 32, verse 1 through 37:24. But Job wasn't intending to say another word. He had made known his case. The defense had rested. It is all done. This is everything I can say. And then he was planning simply to be silent and wait. It's an interesting thought to consider, is it not? What silence might look like in our lives as we consider all the sufferings we go through. Sometimes we can, I've had this happen as far as in sermon study goes, where I will rack my brain and spend hours trying to figure it out. And it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But if I leave it, walk away and go do something else, or even go sleep the night and come back the next time, it's like as clear as day. In other words, the silence speaks. And so, in this case, Job was literally planning and letting the silence speak. Now, he's going to get interrupted by Elihu, but he's not going to respond to Elihu, so we'll wait for that. So, next week, Elihu speaks. Let's pray.